They threw her out like trash into the freezing mud of a Montana November, and the whole town just watched. Aurora thought her life was over that day. She didn't know that the scariest man in the territory, a recluse named Silas Kincaid, who people whispered had a heart made of granite, was watching from the shadows. He didn't offer her pity. He offered her a spare horse and a choice that would change everything. But as the snow began to fall, neither of them knew that the secrets following Aurora up that mountain were far more dangerous than the wolves waiting in the woods. This is the story of how a lonely mountain man offered his spare and accidentally gave away his heart. The mud in Dirtwater Creek wasn't just wet earth. It was a living, sucking thing that seemed to want to pull you down to hell and keep you there. Aurora, unsuspecting O'Malley, found this out the hard way when the front door of Mrs. Higgins' boarding house slammed shut behind her, the vibration rattling the cheap glass panes. Her trunk, a battered leather thing that held the sum total of her 22 years on this earth, landed with a wet thud beside her. "And don't come back until you have silver, you hear me?" Mrs. Higgins screeched from the porch. The woman looked like a dried apple doll left out in the sun too long, her face pinched with a greed that no amount of church-going could hide. "I run a respectable establishment, not a charity ward for drifters with pretty faces and empty pockets." Aurora wiped a splatter of muck from her cheek, her hands trembling. It wasn't the cold biting through her thin calico dress that made her shake. It was the humiliation. It was noon. The street was busy. Miners, fur trappers, and the overly pious women of the Ladies' Auxiliary were all pausing to watch the show. "I told you, Mrs. Higgins," Aurora said, her voice cracking, despite her best efforts to sound brave. "My brother, Thomas. He's sending the money from the claim in Deadwood. The letter is late, that's all. Just 2 more days." "Thomas," Mrs. Higgins spat, "that brother of yours is likely dead in a ditch or drunk in a saloon. You're out, Aurora. Room 4 is going to Mr. Leary. He pays in gold dust, not excuses." The door bolted. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the damp air. Aurora stood there, the icy wind of late November cutting through her shawl. She looked around the street, hoping for a friendly face. She saw the baker, Mr. Henderson, look away and pretend to sweep his stoop. She saw the sheriff, a portly man named Holloway, tip his hat but keep walking towards the saloon. Nobody wanted to cross Mrs. Higgins, and nobody wanted to take on a charity case with winter coming on. She dragged her trunk toward the awning of the general store, just to get out of the drizzle. She sat on the cold wood, pulling her knees to her chest. She had nowhere to go. No money for a horse, no money for a stagecoach, and certainly no money for food. That was when the shadow fell over her. It was a large shadow, blocking out the grey light of the sun. The smell hit her first: wood smoke, pine resin, fierce tobacco, and the distinct musk of wet bear fur. Aurora looked up and up. The man standing over her was a giant. He had to be 6'4", with shoulders that spanned the width of the doorway he had just exited. His beard was a thicket of iron grey and black, wild and unkempt, hiding half his face. But it was his eyes that froze her. Pale blue, like the ice on the high peaks. They weren't unkind, but they were hard, unyielding. This was Silas Kincaid. The town whispered about him. They said he lived on the high ridge, past where any sane man would build a cabin. They said he had killed a bear with a knife. They said he had a wife once, years ago. But the mountain took her, and he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to a living soul since. Silas shifted a heavy sack of flour onto his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. He looked at Mrs. Higgins' closed door, then down at Aurora, shivering in the mud, then at her battered trunk. "She put you out," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder deep in a canyon. It wasn't a question. Aurora straightened her spine. She wouldn't beg. Not to him. "It appears so, Mr. Kincaid. You got kin? A brother. In Deadwood. Deadwood is 300 miles that way. Silas gestured vaguely with a gloved hand that was the size of a shovel. You won't make the first 10 miles in those shoes. Aurora tucked her scuffed boots under her skirt. I'll manage. No, you won't. You'll freeze, or the coyotes will get you. Or worse, the two-legged kind of coyote. He glanced towards the saloon, where a few rough-looking men were eyeing Aurora with predatory interest. Silas sighed, a sound of immense irritation. He adjusted his hat, a battered Stetson stained with rain and sweat. He looked like a man arguing with himself and losing. I got a spare, he grunted. Aurora blinked. Excuse me? Horse. I got a spare horse. Pack mare, mostly. But she can carry a rider if she ain't carrying feed. And I got a spare room. It ain't much, just a lean-to off the main cabin. But it's got a stove. Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs. Go with Silas Kincaid? Alone? Into the mountains? The women in town said he was a savage. I couldn't impose, Aurora stammered. I can't pay you. Silas spat into the mud, missing her boot by an inch. Didn't ask for pay. I need someone to mind the fire and help cure the hides this winter. My hands. The arthritis is getting into the knuckles when the frost hits. You work, you eat, you stay warm. Come spring, you take one of my furs, sell it, and buy your ticket to Deadwood. It was a business transaction. He made it sound cold, logical, but Aurora saw something else in those icy eyes. He was looking at the men by the saloon, his jaw set. He was offering protection. Why? She asked softly. Silas looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Because I got a mare outside that hates the rain, and you look like you hate it more. Are you coming? Or are you gonna sit there until you turn into an ice sculpture? Aurora looked at the boarding house that had rejected her. She looked at the leering men by the saloon. Then she looked at the mountain man. He was terrifying, yes, but he was the only one standing between her and the abyss. I'm coming, she whispered. Silas nodded once. He reached down, grabbed her heavy trunk with one hand, and hoisted it up. Let's ride. Storm's coming. The ride up the mountain was not a romantic jaunt. It was a brutal, bone-jarring ascent into a world that grew whiter and colder with every mile. Aurora rode the spare mare, a sturdy beast named Bessie, who seemed to resent the extra weight. Silas rode ahead on a massive black stallion he called Judge. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. He just cut a path through the snow-laden pines, his figure a dark silhouette against the blinding white. By the time they reached the tree line, the snow had started to fall in earnest, thick, heavy flakes that stuck to Aurora's eyelashes. Her fingers were numb inside her thin gloves. She wrapped the buffalo robe Silas had tossed her tighter around her shoulders, burying her nose in the fur. It smelled like him. Keep up, Silas shouted over the wind. Ridge is treacherous here. Don't let Bessie wander. I'm trying, Aurora yelled back, her teeth chattering. They rode for 4 hours. The town of Dirtwater Creek disappeared, swallowed by the mist below. Up here the air was thin and sharp. It felt like a different country, a country ruled by silence and stone. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep indigos, Silas finally pulled Judge to a halt. He pointed ahead. Home. Aurora squinted. Nestled against a granite cliff face, protected by a grove of ancient pines, was a cabin. It was built of massive logs, chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. A barn stood off to the side, along with a smokehouse. It looked sturdy. It looked permanent. They rode into the yard, the snow crunching loudly under hooves. Silas dismounted with a grace that belied his size. He walked over to Aurora, who was so stiff she couldn't move her leg to dismount. Frozen? He asked. I think my legs have fallen off, she managed a weak joke. Without a word, Silas reached up and grabbed her by the waist. His hands were massive, encompassing her entire torso. He lifted her off the horse and set her down in the snow. Her knees buckled immediately. He caught her. For a second, she was pressed against his chest. A wall of wool and muscle. She felt the heat radiating off him. She looked up, and for the first time she saw his face up close without the shadow of a hat. There were lines of pain etched deep around his eyes, scars that spoke of a hard life. He released her quickly, stepping back as if he'd been burned. "Get inside. Doors unlocked. Start the fire up. I'll see to the horses." Aurora stumbled toward the cabin. She pushed the heavy oak door open and fell inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the embers of a dying fire in the massive hearth, but it was warm. Oh God, it was warm. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above. There was a large wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jars and books. Books, that surprised her. She didn't take Silas Kincaid for a reader. She moved to the hearth, her hands shaking as she fed kindling to the embers. The fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Minutes later the door opened, bringing a swirl of snow with it. Silas stomped his boots, carrying her trunk and 2 saddlebags. He dropped the trunk near a door on the far wall. "That's the spare room," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. Used to be for storage. I cleared it out last month. Mattress is straw, but the blankets are wool." "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. Truly." "Silas," he grunted. "Mr. Kincaid was my father, and he was a mean son of a bitch. Call me Silas." He moved to the small kitchen area, pumping water into a kettle. "You know how to cook, Aurora?" I can make a stew, and biscuits." "Good, because I cook like a bear with 2 left paws. There's venison in the larder and potatoes in the bin. You cook, I'll chop wood." It was an arrangement, a division of labor. It felt safe. That first night, the storm howled outside like a banshee, shaking the sturdy shutters, but inside the fire crackled. They ate in silence. The stew was simple, but to Aurora it tasted like salvation. Silas watched her eat. He wasn't staring exactly, but he was observing her. He noticed how she held her spoon, delicately, like a lady. He noticed the way her hair, a fiery auburn now that it was drying, curled around her face. "You're running from something," Silas said suddenly. Aurora froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "I told you, my brother." "I ain't talking about money, girl. You got a look in your eye, like a deer that smells the wolf but can't see it yet." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. "Who is he?" Aurora set her spoon down. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt a bit stifling. She hadn't planned to tell anyone. It was too dangerous. "His name is Barnaby Finch," she whispered. Silas's eyes narrowed. The name clearly meant something to him. His hand, resting on the table, clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. "Barnaby Finch," Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "The land developer from Chicago, the one buying up the valley." He wants to marry me," Aurora admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "My father owed him a debt before he passed. Finch said he'd forgive the debt if I became his wife. But I've seen him. I've seen what he does to his horses. I couldn't do it. So I ran." Silas was silent for a long time. He stood up, walking to the window and peering out into the black storm. "Finch is a snake," Silas said, his back to her. "He's been trying to buy this mountain for 2 years. Thinks there's silver in the caves up north." He turned around, his face grim. "If he finds out you're here—" "He won't," Aurora said quickly. "He thinks I went to St. Louis. I made sure to tell the station master that loudly before I snuck off." "Men like Finch don't give up on their property," Silas said darkly. "And that's what you are to him. Property." He walked over to the fireplace and picked up a heavy Winchester rifle that was leaning against the stone. He checked the lever action, the metallic click-clack loud in the room. He placed it back down, but closer to his chair this time. "You're safe here, Aurora," he said. "The pass will be snowed in by morning. Nobody comes up or down this mountain until I say so. You sleep. We got work to do at dawn." Aurora retreated to the spare room. It was small, smelling of cedar and sage. She climbed under the heavy wool blankets, listening to the wind. She thought she would be terrified. She was in a cabin with a strange, violent man, miles from civilization. But as she closed her eyes, she didn't feel fear. She remembered the way he had lifted her from the horse. She remembered the way he checked the rifle when she mentioned Finch's name. For the first time in months, Aurora O'Malley fell asleep without one eye open. Outside, in the main room, Silas didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, whittling a piece of pine, staring at the door to the spare room. He had lived alone for 5 years. He liked the silence. He liked the loneliness. It was penance for the past. But now, there was a woman in his house. A woman with hair like autumn leaves and eyes that held too much sorrow. And she was running from the one man Silas hated more than anyone on earth. "Finch," he muttered to the fire. He stabbed the knife into the wood. "You come up this mountain, and you won't be walking down." The wind howled, signaling the start of the deep winter. The two of them were trapped now, together. And the story was just beginning. December descended on the mountain like a heavy white shroud. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, reduced to the howling wind and the endless accumulation of snow. For 3 weeks, Silas and Aurora lived in a rhythm dictated by survival. Aurora expected the silence to be oppressive. Instead, she found it companionable. She learned the moods of the mountain man. She learned that when he tugged on his left ear, the barometer was dropping. She learned that when he spent hours oiling his traps, his mind was walking down dark paths she couldn't follow. She worked harder than she ever had in her life. She scrubbed the rough pine floors until her knees were bruised. She learned to skin a rabbit without flinching, though her stomach turned the first few times. She baked biscuits in the cast-iron Dutch oven, the smell of yeast and browning flour slowly replacing the scent of stale tobacco in the cabin. Silas watched her. He watched her the way a wolf watches a strange bird that has landed in its territory. Curious, wary, and increasingly protective. One evening, deep in the belly of winter, the wind died down, leaving a silence so profound it rang in the ears. They were sitting by the fire. Silas was mending a bridle, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising dexterity, though Aurora noticed the occasional wince. "Your hands are hurting again," Aurora said softly. She didn't look up from the shirt she was darning, one of his old flannels that swallowed her frame. "Cold gets in the joints," Silas grunted. "Old break. Fighting a claim jumper back in 78. "Let me see." Silas froze. "It's fine, Aurora." "It's not fine. You dropped the coffee pot this morning. Give me your hand, Silas." Her voice was firm. It was the tone she used on Bessie the mare when the horse was being stubborn. Slowly, reluctantly, Silas extended his right hand across the rough-hewn table. Aurora took it. Her hands were small and pale against his weather-beaten skin. His hand was a map of violence, knuckles swollen, white scars crisscrossing the back, calluses as hard as wood. She reached for the tin of arnica salve she had found in the cupboard. She began to massage the salve into his knuckles. Silas hissed a breath through his teeth, his muscles tensing. "Relax," she murmured. "You're fighting it." "I ain't used to soft things," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual. Aurora didn't stop. She worked her thumbs into the stiff tendons, feeling the heat of his skin. "Everyone needs softness, Silas. Even mountains have moss." He looked at her then. The firelight caught the copper in her hair, turning it to spun gold. She was biting her lower lip in concentration, determined to ease his pain. A strange sensation bloomed in Silas's chest. Not the pain of the arthritis, but a dull, aching longing he thought he had buried with his wife, Mary, 10 years ago. "You remind me of her," he said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Aurora's hand stilled. She looked up, her eyes wide. "Your wife?" Silas pulled his hand back gently, unable to bear the touch any longer. It was too much. "Mary," She was light, like you. She thought she could tame this mountain. She thought if we just loved it enough, it wouldn't hurt us. He stood up and walked to the window, staring at his own reflection in the black glass. She went out to check the snares one morning. Just a dusting of snow. But the sheet ice was underneath. She slipped into the ravine. I didn't find her until sundown. The silence in the room was heavy with his grief. "Silas," Aurora whispered, "that wasn't the mountain's fault, and it wasn't yours." "I brought her here," he said, his voice hard as iron. "I brought her to the edge of the world because I didn't want to be around people. I offered her a life of scenery, and I gave her a grave." He turned to face Aurora. "That's why I gave you the spare room, Aurora. Because nothing stays mine for long. I'm a man who loses things." Aurora stood up. She crossed the room, stopping just inches from him. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension in his massive frame. "I am not Mary," she said fiercely, "and I am not a thing to be lost. I'm a survivor, Silas. Look at me. I survived the boarding house. I survived the trail. I'm surviving you." A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. It transformed his face, taking 10 years off his age. "Surviving me, huh? Is that what we're doing?" "I think," Aurora said, her voice trembling slightly, "that we are doing a bit more than surviving." The air between them crackled. Silas reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek. He wanted to touch her. He wanted to pull her into the circle of his arms and promise that no freezing wind or debt-collecting landlord would ever touch her again. But he was a mountain man. He knew the signs of an avalanche before it started, and this feeling was a slide waiting to happen. He dropped his hand. "Get some sleep, Aurora. I'm going to check the barn." He walked out into the freezing night without a coat, needing the bite of the wind to cool the fire in his blood. He didn't know that Aurora watched him from the window, her hand pressing against the glass, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't afraid of Barnaby Finch in that moment. She was afraid of how safe she felt with a man who thought he was a monster. January brought the false thaw. For 3 days, the sun blazed hot and bright, melting the top layer of snow into a slushy mess before freezing it into a treacherous crust at night. It was on the 3rd day of the thaw that the isolation broke. Silas was chopping wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the canyon walls. Aurora was hanging laundry on a line strung between the cabin and the smokehouse, the sheets snapping in the breeze. Judge, the black stallion, whinnied loudly from the corral. His ears were pinned back, looking down the trail. Silas stopped mid-swing. He didn't look at the trail. He looked at the birds. The jays had stopped scolding. The woods were too quiet. "Aurora," he said, his voice low but carrying instantly. "Inside, now." Aurora didn't argue. She saw the set of his shoulders. She dropped the wet sheet into the basket and hurried towards the door. "What is it?" "Company," Silas said. He walked calmly to the porch where his Winchester leaned. He picked it up, cradling it in the crook of his arm. "And nobody I invited." Moments later, 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Leading them was Sheriff Halloway. The heavy-set lawman looked miserable, his face red from the exertion of the climb, his horse blowing hard. Flanking him were 2 men Silas didn't know, hard-eyed men in long dusters, riding horses that looked too expensive for deputy work. They rode into the yard. Silas didn't move. He stood on the porch, a giant guarding his cave. "Afternoon, Silas," Halloway called out, his voice overly cheerful. "Hell of a climb. You trying to keep folks away?" "That's the general idea, Sheriff," Silas drawled. He didn't lower the rifle. "You're a long way from the warm stove at the saloon." Halloway chuckled nervously. He glanced at the 2 men beside him, then back at Silas. "Official business, I'm afraid. We're looking for a missing person. Girl named Aurora O'Malley. Left the boarding house back in November, owing money. Also, there's a matter of a theft." "Theft?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Finch claims she stole a diamond brooch from his office before she ran. One of the men in dusters spoke up. His voice was like grinding gravel. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow. "We're here to recover the property. And the girl." Silas felt a cold rage settle in his gut. A thief? Aurora? The woman who darned his socks and cried over a frozen sparrow she found on the porch? It was a lie. A dirty, clumsy lie manufactured by a powerful man to drag her back. "Haven't seen her," Silas lied smoothly. "Snow's been deep. I don't get visitors." The scarred man narrowed his eyes. He looked past Silas, towards the cabin window. Aurora was there, hidden in the shadows, but the man seemed to sniff the air like a hound. "That's a woman's washing on the line, Kincaid." The scarred man pointed a gloved finger at the laundry Aurora had abandoned. Silas didn't blink. "I take in washing during the winter. Pays better than trapping." The sheriff laughed, trying to break the tension. "Silas has got a sense of humor, boys. Look, Silas, we just need to check the premises. Mr. Finch is very particular. He's offering a $50 reward for the girl. Dead or alive, though he prefers alive." Dead or alive. The threat hung in the air. This wasn't a retrieval. It was a hunt. Silas racked the lever of the Winchester. The sound was unmistakable. The horses danced nervously. "You got a warrant, Holloway?" Silas asked. "Well, no. Not a written one, but—" "Then you got no business on my land. This is private property. My property line starts at the creek crossing. You're trespassing." Silas raised the barrel slightly. "I count to 3. 1. The scarred man moved his hand toward his hip. "I wouldn't," Silas warned, his blue eyes blazing. "I can take the button off your vest from here. You think you can draw before I squeeze?" The deputy hesitated. He looked at Silas, saw the absolute lack of fear, and slowly moved his hand back to the reins. 2, Silas said. All right. Holloway pulled his horse around. "Damn it, Silas, you're making a mistake. Finch owns the mayor. He practically owns the territory. If you're hiding her, he'll burn this mountain down to get her." "Let him try," Silas growled. 3. The riders turned and galloped back towards the tree line, snow kicking up in their wake. Silas watched them until they disappeared. Then he watched the trees for another 10 minutes to make sure they hadn't circled back. He lowered the rifle and turned to the door. Aurora was standing there, her face ashen. She had heard everything. He said, "I stole," she whispered. "I never stole anything in my life. Finch gave me that brooch. He tried to pin it on my dress when he cornered me. I threw it at him." "I know," Silas said roughly. He walked past her, slamming the door and bolting it. He moved to the window, shuttering it tight. "Pack your things," he ordered. Aurora blinked. "What?" "They know you're here. That laundry gave it away. Holloway is a fool, but that man with the scar, that was ruthless work. That was one of the Pinkertons, or worse. They'll be back tonight or tomorrow, and they'll bring fire." He went to the loose floorboard under his bed and pulled out a heavy canvas bag. He started stuffing it with ammunition, dried meat, and bandages. "I'm taking you to the high pass," Silas said, not looking at her. "There's a trapper's cabin on the other side of the ridge. Old Man Miller's place. He's dead, but the cabin stands. You can wait there. I'll lead them off your trail." "No," Aurora said. Silas stopped packing. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" "I said no." Aurora stood tall, though her hands were shaking. "You're sending me away, to hide in a hole while you fight my battle? You said you had a spare room, Silas. You didn't say I was a temporary guest. This ain't Halian. A tea party, Aurora. They are going to kill me, and if they find you, Finch is going to drag you back to a life worse than dying. I promise to keep you safe." "Then keep me safe here," Aurora shouted. She crossed the room and grabbed his arm, stopping his frantic packing. "I am done running. I ran from Ireland. I ran from New York. I ran from the boarding house. I am not running from this mountain, and I am certainly not leaving you to die alone in the snow." Silas looked down at her. Her eyes were blazing with a fire that matched his own. She wasn't the frightened girl in the mud anymore. She was a woman who had found her home, and she was ready to fight for it. "You're a fool," Silas whispered, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm your fool, then," she countered. "You offered your spare, Silas. Well, I'm taking the rest. I'm taking the danger, too." Silas dropped the bag. He looked at the door, then back at her. The walls of the cabin felt smaller, the air tighter. The siege had begun. "If you stay," Silas said, his voice deadly serious, "you do exactly what I say. You learn to shoot that shotgun hanging over the mantel. And you don't hesitate, because when they come back, they won't be knocking." "Teach me," Aurora said. Silas nodded. It was a pact, sealed not in blood, but in gunpowder. "Get the gun," he said. The next 2 days were a blur of bruised shoulders and the smell of sulfur. Silas didn't go easy on her. He marched Aurora out to the edge of the clearing where he had set up empty tin cans on a stump. The wind was biting, whipping Aurora's hair across her face, but she didn't complain. "Tuck it tighter into the pocket of your shoulder," Silas instructed, his voice gruff. He stood behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his arms encircling hers to guide the heavy barrel of the double-barreled shotgun. "If you don't hold it tight, the kick will knock you flat. Lean into it. Become the rock." Aurora nodded, squinting down the sight. "Become the rock!" Boom! The gun roared, bucking violently. The tin can flew into the snow, shredded. Aurora stumbled back, gasping, but Silas's steady hands caught her shoulders. "Good," he murmured near her ear. "Again, reload." They practiced until her fingers were raw and her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache. But with every shot, the terror that had lived in Aurora's gut since the boarding house began to recede. It was being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. By the evening of the second day, the cabin was transformed. They had boarded up the lower half of the windows, leaving only narrow firing slits. They had filled buckets with water and placed them near the door. The homey atmosphere was gone, replaced by the grim utility of a fortress. That night, the silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of winter. It was the holding breath silence before a scream. Silas sat by the fire, cleaning his Winchester. Aurora sat opposite him, loading shotgun shells with methodical precision. "You did good today," Silas said, breaking the quiet. He didn't look up from the rifle. "I missed the last 3 shots," Aurora replied. "You hit the tree behind them. At 10 yards, that's enough to stop a man." He set the rifle down and finally looked at her. His blue eyes were dark, swirling with emotions he usually kept locked behind the iron bars of his discipline. "Aurora," she stopped loading. "Yes, Silas? If they come, if it goes bad." He cleared his throat, struggling with the words. "There's a trap door under the rug in the pantry. It leads to a root cellar that tunnels out to the creek bed. If I tell you to run, you go. You don't look back. You take Bessie and you ride for the pass." Aurora stood up. She walked around the table and knelt beside his chair. She took his rough, scarred hands in hers. "I told you," she said softly. "I'm not running. We fight together." "Why?" Silas asked, his voice cracking. "I'm just a broken-down trapper living on a rock. You're young. You have a life." "I have a life because of you," she said. She reached up and touched his beard, her fingers grazing the rough hair. "Mrs. Higgins threw me away. The town watched. You were the only one who saw me. You offered me your spare room. You offered me your spare horse." She leaned in closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But I don't want the spare anymore, Silas. I want the rest." Silas shuddered. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the walls he had built around his heart since Mary died crumbled into dust. "I ain't got much," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I got a cabin that drafts in the north wind. I got a bad hand, and I got a heart that's been frozen for 10 years. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "But if you want it, he breathed. "It's yours, every beat of it. It's yours until the day I die." "Then don't die." Aurora kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was desperate, fueled by the adrenaline of the looming danger and months of unspoken longing. Silas groaned, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her onto his lap. He kissed her like a drowning man finding air, fierce and claiming. For an hour, the war outside didn't exist. There was only the firelight, the warmth of skin on skin, and the promise made in the shadow of death. But the world has a way of interrupting. At midnight, the dogs in the barn, 2 massive wolfhounds Silas kept for bear protection, started barking. Not the bark of seeing a squirrel, the deep, guttural bark of sensing a predator. Silas broke the kiss instantly. The softness vanished from his face, replaced by the mask of the warrior. He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness save for the dying embers. "They're here," he whispered. Silas moved to the window, peering through the slit in the boards. The moon was full, casting a blue light over the snow. "3 riders coming up the main trail," he whispered. "But that's a decoy. Finch isn't stupid." He scanned the tree line. There, 2 on foot, circling the back near the smokehouse. "What do we do?" Aurora asked. She had the shotgun in her hands. Her knuckles were white, but her hands were steady. "I'll take the back. You watch the front. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, Aurora. Don't waste the shell." "Silas Kincaid!" The voice boomed from the front yard. It was Barnaby Finch. He was sitting on a tall bay horse, surrounded by 4 hired guns. He wore a fur-lined coat that probably cost more than Silas's entire cabin. "I know you're in there, you old badger," Finch yelled, "and I know you have the girl. Send her out. We can end this civilized." Silas cracked the window open just an inch. "Get off my land, Finch, or I'll bury you on it." Finch laughed. It was a cruel, high sound. "Bury me? With what army? I brought 10 men, Silas. 10. And we brought kerosene." At the word kerosene, Silas's blood ran cold. Fire. The mountain man's worst nightmare. "Listen to me, Aurora," Finch shouted, his voice shifting to a mocking sweetness. "Come out, darling. I have news. From Deadwood. A letter came yesterday." Aurora froze near the front peephole. "Thomas," she whispered. "Your brother Thomas," Finch yelled, holding up a piece of paper. "Sad news, I'm afraid. Mining accident. A collapse. They say he didn't suffer much. Just crushed flat." Finch crumpled the paper and tossed it into the snow. "He's gone, Aurora. You have nobody. Nobody but me." A wail tore from Aurora's throat, a sound of pure anguish. "Don't listen to him," Silas roared, grabbing her arm. "He's lying. He's trying to break you." "He's dead," Aurora sobbed, the shotgun dipping. "Thomas is dead. He might be," Silas said, shaking her hard. "But you aren't. Look at me. If you go out there, you join him. Do you understand? Fight for him. Avenge him." The word avenge cut through her grief. Aurora looked up, her tears drying instantly, replaced by a cold fury that matched the winter night. She raised the shotgun. "Burn them out," Finch commanded. A bottle with a burning rag sailed through the air. It smashed against the porch. Another hit the roof. The dry timber, despite the snow, caught fast. "Take the back!" Silas yelled. He spun to the rear window and fired his Winchester. Crack thud. One of the men sneaking near the smokehouse dropped into the snow. The other scrambled behind a tree. At the front, Aurora saw a man running towards the door with an axe. She didn't hesitate. She remembered the tin cans. She remembered the kick. Boom! The door splintered as the buckshot tore through the wood, catching the attacker in the leg. He screamed and went down. "She's shooting back!" someone yelled. "The girl is shooting back! Kill them both!" Finch screamed, losing his composure. The cabin was filling with smoke. The roof was crackling. The heat was becoming unbearable. "We can't stay here," Silas coughed, firing 2 more rounds. "The roof is going to collapse. We have to make for the barn. The barn is 30 yards away." Aurora shouted over the roar of the fire. "We'll be cut down." "Not if I draw their fire," Silas said grimly. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and a chair. "I'm going out the front. I'll make a noise. You go out the back window, crawl to the woodpile, and cover me. Can you do that?" "Silas, no! You'll be killed! Go!" he roared, shoving her towards the back room. Aurora scrambled through the window, dropping into the cold snow behind the cabin. The heat from the burning roof seared her back. She army-crawled towards the woodpile, dragging the shotgun. She heard Silas yell, a primal, terrifying war cry. The front door kicked open. Silas threw the chair out first. Gunfire erupted immediately, splinters flying everywhere. Silas dove out, rolling off the porch, firing his Winchester from the hip. He took down a man near the well. But there were too many. "There he is!" Finch shouted. "Leg him! Don't kill him yet! I want him to watch!" A bullet caught Silas in the thigh. He grunted, his leg buckling. He fell into the mud and snow, his rifle spinning away. Two men rushed him, kicking him hard in the ribs. Silas groaned, curling up, but he reached for his knife. A boot stomped on his wrist, breaking it. Finch rode closer, looking down at the fallen mountain man. The cabin was a torch behind them, lighting up the horrific scene. "Where is she?" Finch demanded. "Where is the little thief?" Silas spat blood onto Finch's polished boot. "Gone to hell," he wheezed. "She's waiting for you." Finch pulled a revolver. "Check the back," he ordered his men. One of the men started towards the rear of the cabin. Aurora was behind the woodpile. She saw Silas bleeding in the snow. She saw Finch raising his gun to finish him. She saw the man coming toward her hiding spot. She had 2 shells left in the shotgun. She could run. The woods were right there. In the confusion, she could disappear into the dark. Silas had told her to run, but Silas had also offered her his heart. Aurora O'Malley stood up from behind the woodpile. She didn't look like a victim anymore. With the fire raging behind her, she looked like a spirit of vengeance. "Finch!" she screamed. Barnaby Finch turned in his saddle, startled. Aurora didn't aim for the men. She aimed for the one thing Finch prized above all else. She aimed for the saddlebag on his horse, right where the cinch held tight. Boom! The shot didn't kill the horse, but it grazed the flank and shattered the cinch buckle. The horse, already panicked by the fire, reared violently. Finch, caught off guard, slid backward as the saddle slipped. He flailed, his foot catching in the stirrup. "Get him, Judge!" Silas yelled from the ground. Silas's black stallion, Judge, had kicked open the unlatched barn door in the panic. Seeing the commotion and hearing his master's voice, the massive warhorse charged. It was chaos. Finch's horse bolted, dragging the screaming land developer by his caught foot through the fire-lit snow. The hired guns panicked, their horses spooking at the charging stallion. "Now, Aurora, run!" Silas shouted, trying to drag himself up. Aurora didn't run away. She ran to him. She dropped the empty shotgun and grabbed Silas under his arm. "Up! Get up, you stubborn mule! Leave me! Shut up and walk!" Adrenaline gave her the strength of 10 men. She hauled the giant mountain man up. They hobbled toward the darkness of the trees, just as the roof of the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks, separating them from the confused gunmen. They made it into the dense pine forest, the darkness swallowing them whole. Behind them, the men were shouting, trying to calm their horses and chase after the dragging Finch. Silas collapsed against a tree, breathing hard. You stayed." Aurora tore a strip from her petticoat and began to bind his bleeding leg. Her hands were covered in soot, her face streaked with tears and ash. "I told you," she panted, looking into his eyes. "I am not Mary, and I am not losing you." Silas reached out, touching her face with his bloodied hand. "We ain't safe yet. Finch, if he survives that drag, he'll turn the whole territory over." "Let him try," Aurora said, picking up his fallen knife from the snow. "He just made one mistake." "What's that?" "He burned down our home," Aurora said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Now we have nothing to lose." The night was no longer just cold. It was a living, breathing malice. Silas and Aurora moved through the deep tree line like ghosts, leaving a trail of blood in the virgin snow. Silas was fading. The bullet in his thigh had missed the artery, but the blood loss was significant. He leaned heavily on Aurora, his breathing ragged clouds of steam in the freezing air. "Leave me here," Silas grunted, stumbling over a buried root. "I can hold them off. You make for the ridge." "Shut up, Silas," Aurora hissed, her voice steel. "You didn't leave me at the boarding house. I'm not leaving you on the mountain." They reached the Devil's Throat, a narrow, treacherous ravine that cut through the granite cliffs. A fallen log bridged the chasm, slick with ice and snow. Below, 100 feet down, the river roared, black and hungry. "We cross," Aurora said, eyeing the slippery log. "With my leg, I'll fall," Silas argued, "then crawl, because they're coming." Behind them, the sound of horses crashing through the underbrush grew louder. Finch was relentless. The man had been dragged, battered, and humiliated, but his greed was a stronger fuel than pain. Silas dropped to his knees. He looked at the log, then at Aurora. "Go first." Aurora shimmied across the icy log, her heart in her throat. She made it to the other side and turned, extending her hand. "Come on!" Silas dragged himself onto the log. He was halfway across when the first shot rang out. A bullet chipped the wood inches from his hand. Finch emerged from the trees. He was a nightmare to behold. His fine coat was shredded, one eye was swollen shut from the dragging, and he held his revolver with a shaking, manic hand. 3 of his hired guns stood behind him. "Nowhere left to run, you mountain trash!" Finch screamed, his voice cracking. Silas stopped in the middle of the log, hovering over the abyss. He looked up at Finch. "You want the land so bad, Finch?" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Come and claim it!" Finch laughed, a sound that bordered on madness. "I don't need to come there. I can drop you into the river and walk across your corpse." He raised the gun, aiming for Silas's head. Aurora didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at the snowbank above Finch's head. Silas had told her about the acoustics of the Devil's Throat. He had told her why he never fired a gun in this specific canyon during the thaw. The vibration. Aurora pulled the revolver she had taken from Silas's belt. She didn't aim at Finch. She aimed straight up, at the massive, overhanging shelf of snow and ice clinging precariously to the cliff edge directly above the posse. "What are you doing, girl?" Finch sneered, seeing her aim at the sky. "Praying?" "No," Aurora said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I'm knocking." She fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots slapped against the canyon walls, echoing back and forth, magnifying in intensity. Crack, crack, crack. For a second, nothing happened. Finch started to laugh. "You missed the sky, you stupid—" A low groan interrupted him. It came from the mountain itself. The snow shelf above them fractured with a sound like a cannon blast. Finch looked up, his one good eye widening in horror. He didn't even have time to scream. The avalanche came down not as a slide, but as a hammer. Tons of white death detached from the cliff face. It buried Finch and his men instantly, sweeping them off the ledge and hurling them down into the ravine below. The force of the wind from the displacement nearly knocked Silas off the log. He clung to the wood, burying his face in the bark as the world turned white. Silence returned as quickly as it had left. Where Finch and his men had stood, there was nothing. No trees, no path, no villains. Just a clean, white scar on the side of the mountain. Silas looked up, shaking the snow from his beard. He looked across the chasm. Aurora was standing there, the smoking gun in her hand. She looked like a Valkyrie. "Did you get them?" Silas rasped. "The mountain got them," Aurora whispered. She dropped the gun and fell to her knees, reaching out for him. "Now come home, Silas." It took them 3 hours to limp to the old trapper's cave Silas had mentioned. It was cold, damp, and smelled of musk, but it was safe. Aurora built a fire. She cleaned Silas's wound with snowmelt and bound it with the rest of her petticoat. She held him through the fever that came in the night, her body acting as his anchor to the world of the living. "You saved me," Silas murmured in the dark, his hand gripping hers. "We saved each other," she replied. 2 days later the fever broke, and a week after that, Sheriff Holloway finally made it up the mountain with a search party. They found the remains of the cabin, and they found the aftermath of the avalanche. They assumed everyone was dead, until they saw the smoke rising from the cave. 3 months later, the snow was melting in Dirtwater Creek. The mud was back, but it didn't look as menacing as it used to. Aurora stood on the porch of the new cabin. It was built on the same foundation as the old one, but it was bigger. There were 2 rocking chairs out front. A rider came up the trail. It was a young man, thin and pale but smiling. "Thomas!" Aurora screamed, dropping her basket of laundry. It was her brother. The letter had been a forgery, just as Silas suspected. Finch had intercepted Thomas's real letters. Thomas had arrived in town looking for her, hearing stories of a mountain queen who had brought down the corrupt land baron. Silas stepped out of the cabin. He walked with a limp now, leaning on a cane he had whittled himself. He watched the reunion, the tears, the hugs. He felt a familiar tug of fear. She had her brother back. She had the deed to Finch's estate, which the town had awarded her after the sheriff uncovered Finch's fraud in his office. She could go anywhere. St. Louis, New York, Paris. Thomas pulled away and looked at the giant man on the porch. He looked terrified. Is this him? The one who kidnapped you?" Thomas asked protectively. Aurora turned. She looked at Silas. She saw the grey in his beard, the scar on his leg, the hesitation in his blue eyes. She saw the man who had offered his spare when the world offered her nothing. She walked up the steps and took Silas's hand, interlacing her fingers with his scarred ones. "Kidnapped!" Aurora laughed, the sound ringing through the valley like a bell. "No, Thomas, this is Silas. He didn't take my life." She looked up at the mountain man, her eyes full of a love that was as wild and enduring as the land itself. "He gave me one." Silas squeezed her hand. For the first time in his life, the mountain didn't feel lonely. It felt full. "Welcome home, Thomas," Silas rumbled. "Dinner's on the stove. Don't mind the wolfhounds. They only bite strangers." And as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in violet and gold, the lonely mountain man realized he didn't have a spare heart anymore. It was fully occupied. And that, my friends, is how a tragedy in the mud became a legend on the mountain. Finch thought he could buy anything with gold, but he learned the hard way that you can't buy the loyalty of a woman like Aurora, and you certainly can't buy the mercy of the mountain. Sometimes, when life closes a door in your face, it's just pushing you towards the one person who is waiting to open theirs. If you enjoyed this story of survival, romance, and hard-earned karma, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It helps the channel grow more than you know. And if you want more stories about the Wild West, untamed hearts, and epic twists, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. What do you think? Did Finch get what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.